Welcome to Behind the Research, where we take you into the thinking, methods, and approach of various episodes of Taste and See TV, as well as the angles, theories, and perspectives that we decided to cut from the research. Now, today we are jumping all the way back to episode 1, Mount Carmel, the showdown, the fire test between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Now, we have often wanted to go back and just redo this episode because, let's be honest, the video quality, editing, audio, it was rough. We were starting out, we didn't know what we were doing, but it's a little bit iconic because it is episode 1, it's how we started out. So we've decided to preserve it, but use this series Behind the Research to go deeper into the research and include some of the aspects and more of the thinking that we cut from it. Now, as you know, Taste and See TV, what we love to do is really pull back the curtain, show how these old rabbinic, Christian, archaeological, and scholarly narratives have not just shaped our thinking on biblical accounts, but stuck us in the thinking on biblical accounts. And nobody ever questions it. It's just how it was. Although everything we know about history has kind of moved forward from there, we stay sentimentality back where we were. So that's what we're going to focus on, is our research for the Elijah and the priests of Baal, who were the Baals, and the priests of Baal and the priests of the ashera. That's what we're going to get into. Now, early archaeologists are to blame on this one. Usually we're blaming the rabbis or the Christian traditions, but this case, it's archaeologists and scholars that are to blame. They're the ones who set the mold back in the 1800s and said, Baal is the name of a god, a Canaanite god, a Canaanite storm god and rain god. And so that's the god of the showdown, and that is that. But it ignores not just basic principles of archaeology, it ignores the Bible. Right? So why do we say that? Well, we know Baal is a title. It's not the name of a god because there were many Baals listed, and that's the other aspect it ignores from the Bible, is that there's a lot of Baals. Different regions and cities had different Baals. If it was all the same Baal and the same god, then you wouldn't need all these different Baals. So clearly there is a difference between them all. The other big thing, of course, that as a researcher you should be asking, and a Bible reader you should be asking, is that if Baal was a storm god who brought about rain, how was it fair to challenge him to a test to bring about fire? Fire and rain, I don't know, that's opposite in my mind, right? So that's the simple premise of the research in the episode. How does a rain god fit in with a fire test? And the answer was, it doesn't. It doesn't. So that means it must be wrong. Elijah must be challenging a different god to this showdown. So how do we approach the research? How should you approach the research? It's the same thing we always say: context, 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 timing, and location. You cannot look at North Syria and say, well, there's a Baal here in 1500 BCE that is a rain god. Okay, different location, different time. You know, we are looking for the most likely Baal to be worshipped during the life of Ahab and Jezebel in the area of northern Israel, the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel, and Phoenicia. That's who we're looking for. So we have a very narrow scope of research. And it's very easy as well. That's the crazy thing why we're amazed that people don't run with the same theory we do, is because it's very simple research. This is like 101. So Jezebel's the key player in this one. Basically, Jezebel's from Sidon. Now, I put out the idea, and my thought is that it's not just Sidon, it's also Tyre, and that's because these cities were connected. We know that Jezebel's father seized the throne through assassination. So because he becomes the king of Sidon, Sidon and Tyre changed places from time to time as to which city was the prominent city. Sometimes it was Tyre, sometimes it was Sidon, but these city-states were all connected through like a confederation. So, you know, whichever the god of Sidon and Tyre were kind of the gods for the whole empire. This is what we see throughout the Phoenician history. And we'll see this going onward because these same gods and goddesses were still the gods and goddesses of the Phoenicians when it morphed into the Punic Empire, hundreds of years later. They were still using the same gods and goddesses. So it's safe to say Sidon, Tyre, those gods and goddesses, the tutelary god and goddess. Tutelary just means like the god of the city, the protector of the city. That's who we're looking for. We learned from, against Apion, Josephus, and Menander, that Jezebel's father wasn't just the king seizing the throne through assassination. He was also the high priest of Astarte. We'll get into Astarte in a moment, but that might not be entirely correct. We're going to crack into that in a moment. Put that aside. Don't get sidetracked like I do in the research. Focus on the god. Astarte is a goddess. The thing it confirms for you, though, is that being a high priest, and then Jezebel would have likely been a high priestess, any political alliance that's being formed between Phoenicia and Israel would not be political, it would also be religious. A high priest would not exclude a religious component from an alliance. And so wherever Jezebel went, her gods and goddesses went with her. So this is why we zone in on who were Jezebel's gods and goddesses. Now, history is very easy. Like we said, we know that the protector god of Tyre was Melkart, and also Sidon, although primarily Tyre. But again, Ethbal is the king not just of Sidon, it's of that whole Phoenician area, which would include Tyre. These two cities are the prominent ones. Baal Melkart is the Baal we're looking for. And I'd be surprised if you could find an archaeologist or scholar that would debate me on that one. Now, it's also very clear it's Melkart because there's a very clear match biblically. Because we have the taunting of Elijah that gives us insight into the traits of this tutelary god. So first, Melkart was known as a patron god of sailors and travelers, which makes sense when we know the Phoenicians, their love of trade and travel, expanding to these colonies beyond the mainland of the Levant. But also, Melkart was known as being the fire from heaven. Right? This is how he was pictured, was from a eternal flame burning in the temple. There you go. That's your match. The fire, he's asked to produce fire. When we look at the Bible and what the Bible actually gives us, what is the actual challenge here? It has nothing to do with rain, right? It's not about who can make it rain. It's who can produce fire. Rain was not a factor to the fire test. It's not a rain test, it's a fire test. Why? Because you can see that the rain was a byproduct. It was a blessing. As a result of the fire test, as a result of the Israelites rejecting the Baals and returning to God, the result was Elijah could now pray, and the blessing that came was rain. Rain was not part of this test. So, again, we in our mind, we connect it. We go, well, it rained right after. Yes, but that's a byproduct. So that's how we know it's not a rain god. Now, when you go into Melkart's background and history, we talk about these taunts of Elijah. He was known for journeying. He was known as a sleeping god, which we'll get into in a moment. We need to remember that Elijah would have been very familiar with the cult of Melkart because Elijah lived there, right? He was in Zarephath. Turn the pages of the Bible back a little bit, right? He's staying with the widow of Zarephath. Where's Zarephath? It's between Sidon and Tyre. So he's very familiar with Jezebel's background. And I mean, talk about the best place to... I can't remember if we even had this on the episode, but talk about an amazing place to hide from Jezebel is like in her hometown. You're never going to find him there. You're never going to think to look to him there. Like, he walks right into the belly of the beast to hide from her. Fantastic. Now, Melkart, interesting god, interesting historical figure, shall we call him. It's, again, we go into this in a later episode from Mycenae, Greece, episode 98. The thought is that Melkart may have originally started as an actual person and was turned into a deity. This is what we see with a lot of these gods. But for sure, we know the Greek and Roman Hercules came from Melkart. So for any of those out there who love the comparative mythology theories and like going back and saying, oh, Hercules was based on the Nephilim, Nope, you're wrong. Sorry. And in order to convince me, if you want to convince me that if you want to convince me that Hercules came from the Nephilim, you first need to prove that Melkart came from the Nephilim. Because the Greeks openly admitted that they stole the Hercules backstory and mythos and everything from the Phoenicians. Herodotus, in his book Theogony, where he's tracing back the origins and the stories of the Greek gods and goddesses, he makes a connection. He calls the temple to Melkart in Tyre as the temple to Hercules. And there's a lot of them. Even Josephus mixed it up. By the time of Josephus, he calls it also a temple to Hercules. There was, in their mind, no difference between Melkart and Hercules, but the difference was Melkart came first, and they absorbed Melkart into the Greek culture and changed the name into Hercules and added more stories and stuff. But that's who we're dealing with. So it's very interesting. This is a very influential god in other cultures, Melkart. And it's also interesting, his temple, this is not to get sidetracked, but his temple is thought to have been built by King Hiram, who also helped with the temple in Jerusalem. And there's some interesting design features. It seems like perhaps it also had a holy and holies, holy and most holies, and it also had 2 pillars outside the entrance, like in the temple in Jerusalem, which very similar design features. And then also the idea that he wasn't actually pictured by an image inside his temple. He was pictured by a fire. It's very interesting that if Hiram was behind that, you got to wonder how much of the influence is now coming from the Israelite God, Jehovah, and this idea of not actually picturing your God with an image, but with a flame. It's very curious. So this is the very interesting thing with Melkart, is it's almost like a counterfeit of the worship in Jerusalem in many ways. And so then when you're looking for this God, why would the Israelites be swayed by this Baal? Because it may have been a counterfeit. And it's hard to tell a counterfeit sometimes, right? Now, again, we don't want to get sidetracked. Focus. So, Melkart's also interesting because he's what we call a rebirth god. Life, death, rebirth. He died, or he went to sleep at least every year. Every season, he needed to be woken up again. His consort did this, his goddess, his girlfriend, whatever you want to call her. Sister, sometimes it's sisters. There's a lot of gods like this. Tammuz in Mesopotamia was one. Adonis in Greece was another one. These dying gods, they had to be brought back each time, or, with Adonis, he went to the underworld for part of the year. Tammuz would die, and he had to be resurrected. Does that mean there's a connection between Melkart and Tammuz and Adonis? No. it's a category of God. It's just, it was a quality. And Tammuz is mentioned later in the Bible in Ezekiel. So it was just a cultural thing, but there's no connection between Melkart and Tammuz. And we know this because the Phoenicians had an equivalent for Tammuz, and it's not Melkart. So it's a coincidence. So again, drop the comparative mythology, focus on Melkart. Which is what I should be doing. So basically, Melkart is the Baal. This is the priests of Baal are substitute Baal with Melkart. The priests of Melkart are called up, but there is another group that's called up, and that's the priests of the what? Ashera. Now, if you're reading your Bible, this is where when we do our research and our stuff, our episodes, we don't use a single Bible translation. We use many translations and concordances and stuff to find out what's the actual word. And here's why. If you go through different translations, you'll see that these other priests were priests of the sacred pole, sacred tree, the grove, the sacred stem. And this indicates what? We don't really know what ashera means, right? It's a vague term. And so we only kind of know the things associated with asheras, the gods and goddesses connected to it, typically goddesses connected to asheras. And typically a relation to fertility. Now, again, back in the day, in the 1800s, the old scholars tried to morph our thinking in this idea that the asheras were about sexuality and immorality, and it was all this lewdness, and everyone was having a party. And it's like, okay, well, maybe there was partying. But the reality is this idea of human sexuality connected to the asheras it's been dropped by scholars and archaeologists. It's just not proven to be true anymore. The fertility that's being used in this worship was fertility in relation to crops and animals. And this is why there's a connection to trees and nature. It's like this was like the hippies, right? It was like Mother Nature. You could think of it this way. So you had sacred trees and poles, which were basically just another version of a tree. And in the case, sometimes you'd have herbs as well being used, but in the case of Adonis, he actually had a small garden that was used. So this is the idea. It's about nature. That type of fertility and like rebirth is through nature, not human sexuality. One of the known asheras that there's a lot of work done on it by Arthur Evans, the man who was responsible for excavating the Minoan culture on Crete, and specifically Knossos. You can go into some of his work. He does about the Oriental plane tree and how it was connected with this idea of Zeus, and Zeus was born under a plane tree, and so it was sacred, and it reappears throughout their culture. The record is spotty, but we see this connection with the sacred tree or grove or natural element. That's the idea. Now, it's a lot to take in, right? So why do we say it's typically a goddess, right? God, goddess. I mean, first you had that relationship, man-woman relationship. We hit on this in an episode from Cyprus, Mighty Flighty Aphrodite. Great episode title. I'm still proud of it. But we can think of it this way, and we explained it a little bit in that episode. Gods were usually connected with life and death, creation and destruction. That's the gods, the males. That's how they're connected. Why? Okay, well, the destruction aspect is easy because in antiquity, you were most likely to be killed in a war by a man. So, men were the destroyers. They were running around pillaging and burning things to the ground. But as far as creation, and I could be wrong, but I don't know of any goddesses that were associated with creation. I could be wrong. I'd love to find out. Message me if you know of one that I don't know of. I'd love to research it. But why? Well, not to be graphic, but through ejaculation, people could see that there was something that a man produced that caused life, right? Semen. That created life, and not just men, but males of species. They could see this in any mammal, that the male produced something that then life came about as a result. So this is why in a lot of the mythologies, and again, people go down the road of going, oh, it was all sex. No, it was a bit of a scientific procedure, which we hit on in an episode, when the moon god hits your eye. We went into this aspect about the moon gods. People could scientifically observe cause and effect, that men had the ability to create life through this. So we got to remove this sex aspect. These early archaeologists and scholars were really obsessed with sex. I still don't know why, but I get it. Okay, so when it came to the goddesses, though, what was their role? Well, they incubated and preserved the life. This is why the goddesses are often seen either pregnant, they're seen naked with their breasts exposed, breastfeeding, right? Because it's this idea of nurturing. They recognize that the female of the species, of the mammal species, provided milk, which was essential to life. A child without a mother could not survive in antiquity. Without breastfeeding, it just wasn't possible. So the women were regarded as sustainers of life. And fertility was really in relation not just to the ability to have children, but how many children and how many children could reach adulthood, which was rare, right? This is what most people don't talk about, right? Girls were being given off in marriage at the age of like 10 to 13. And today we're horrified by that thought. I mean, this still happens in a lot of parts of the world. We like to ignore this thought, but girls are still given in marriage at the age of 10 in many cultures. But back in antiquity, why was that the case? Because you usually only live to like 30 or 40 years old. This is you're having your midlife crisis at the age of like 18. This is the reality. Biblical kings, when are they having kids? And not just kids, they're surviving child, the kid that succeeds them. It's usually around the age of like 15 or 16 is when they're fathering them. So these are kids having kids. Again, we're horrified today, but back then, if you had 10 kids, only 3 or 4 of them were going to reach adulthood. And there is a good chance that as a mother, you could die in that childbirth process. So the fertility aspect of it was not sexual. It was about the progeny. It was about the ability to keep things going forward as regarding the life cycle. That was a lot, right? So why do we have to get into that? Because there's two. So we have this master god, this Baal, owner god, Melkart, and we have a goddess that accompanies him, because it's not enough to have creation and destruction of life. You have to have the sustenance, the sustaining of life in the goddess, and they work together. For Tyre and Sidon, who was that consort to Melkart? Astarte, but not Astarte. So according to Josephus and others, it was Astarte. But Astarte was not originally Astarte. Astarte was actually two goddesses, Anat and Astarte. They were sister goddesses. They were very, very, very similar, which is why by the time the Greeks came along, they just blended them into one. But if we're going back to that context, time period, the time of Jezebel, it would have been Anat. That's very likely. Anat was the chief goddess and very prominent. She was worshipped by Ramses II, was worshipped, by the Amorites, the Hurrians, the Hittites, the Egyptians, everywhere. Major cities like Mari and Ugarit record about her cult and her worship. She was connected with gods like Dagon that are also mentioned in the Bible. She had a longevity of worship. This was one of the major goddesses, but eventually she was blended with Astarte and became Anat Astarte, and then just Astarte. But it would have been Anat. Now, again, this is a goddess typically pictured naked, and so they go, oh, it's about immorality. No, it was just pictured naked because it was about sustenance of life, so you had large breasts and things like this. This was just how they conveyed these ideas. Now, one of her worship sites, Anat, we actually showed you without saying it in episode 49 from Antakya, Turkey. There's a beautiful coastline there from old Antioch of Syria, and beautiful mountain range in the back, which separates Turkey and Syria, modern day. And this mountain is called Mount Kalish. Hope I said that right. But back in antiquity, it was Mount Safon. That was one of her major worship sites. She was worshipped on the mountains. The other one was Mount Imbubu. Great name for a mountain. But, it reminds me of Aladdin, Prince Ali Abubu. But we don't know where Imbubu is. It's lost to history. So why do we mention the mountain aspect of it? Because Mount Carmel. The site chosen was a mountain. Why? Probably because of Anat being involved. The other aspect is that she was, blood was involved with her ritual. So the spilling of blood through animal sacrifice, but also a ritual cutting, was part of her ritual, her cult. Typically after the winter solstice, the priests of Anat would go up to the mountains, they would start sacrificing and spilling blood for her, cutting themselves, doing all this stuff to wake her, to rouse her to action, and that action was to awaken Melkart, bring him back to life. So they work together, and this is the link in the Bible, because we see the priests of the ashera are doing what? They're spilling blood. They're cutting themselves and causing blood to spill, and so this is an act. It's really easy. So when we remove the archaic idea of these priests of Baal and the sacred pole being the same group, and they're a group of people worshiping a rain god, when we remove that, if you want evidence of the Bible, it's Melkart and Anat. It's the fact that the Bible had to have been written when it claims it was written. Why? Because the cult of Melkart and Anat changed by the year 600 and 500 and 400 BCE, which means that it wouldn't have been accurately recorded in the context of the life of Ahab. It would have been changed to reflect the reality of the 5th century or 4th century or 3rd century BCE or 1st century CE instead of the reality of the 9th or 10th century BCE. So it proves that this was a real historical event because the details are correct of the context of the time period. That's what proves the Bible. It's just so simple and so beautiful. It's just historically accurate through and through. And that's what we really try and do on the show. Strip away the fantastic, although sometimes we do have episodes where we go into the fantastic, which is fantastic. But for these ones where we really want to prove the Bible and just say, look, it's a real honest historical document, this is a fantastic way to do it, is just going into the fire test. And then it's like, so if all these details are correct, then it's like, so then the question is, did a fireball come down on Mount Carmel? Well, you know what, like you're not going to be able to prove that by looking at archaeology. Very unlikely. However, if every other detail of that account is proven historically accurate, then why wouldn't the last detail be accurate? And that's what we do on the show. So hopefully you like the deeper dive into the research. We'll keep doing more and more of these because there's a lot more aspects that we can go deeper in the episodes. We like showing you the episodes with the backdrops and the humor and everything, but we also love, and we know some of you guys love, just stripping down straight into the research, go deep, get to the heart of it, and that's what Behind the Research is